we're seeing extreme weather events taking off like crazy in the Southern Hemisphere, but they don't get the press that the ones in the Northern Hemisphere do. But don't let that fool you.
Welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. Well, some of you may have been asking, and in fact, some of you have been asking, and that's why we're making this video. What about the Southern Hemisphere? Because a lot of what we talk about perhaps eludes the Southern Hemisphere. So we're going to talk about that today. And I'm going to start with this great example of something almost miraculous and revolutionary that happened in 2019. In 2019, Malaysia sent over 300 containers of plastic waste back to their countries of origin. That's right, Canada. That's right, United States. That's right, EU. All of those recyclable containers that you sent to the Southern Hemisphere, they didn't want them. As a matter of fact, the Malaysian Environment Minister, Yao Biyin, said in no uncertain terms, Malaysia will not be a dumping ground to the world. We will fight back. Even though we are a small country, we cannot be bullied by developed countries. And I respect that wholeheartedly. I wish more countries in the Southern Hemisphere would follow suit. I find it to be quite a metaphor, in fact, because the Northern Hemisphere has treated the Southern Hemisphere as a dumping ground. And it's not just a metaphor, not at all. The United States is responsible for 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions, the climate change causing emissions in the world. And the EU is responsible for 29%. And as a matter of fact, the global north, we're not speaking the Northern Hemisphere, but the global north is responsible for 92% of the greenhouse gas emissions. How fair is that? It is not fair at all. And we're going to be talking about how these countries are affected by global warming, how these countries are affected by their oceans being choked with plastic and other detritus from the Northern Hemisphere, and our gluttonous ways of ever accumulating more and more. It has an impact. It has an impact. And a UN Global Assessment report has declared that nature is being broken down hundreds of times faster than in the past 10 million years. Think about that. Longer than we Homo sapiens, which I often say, how sapient are we? We're not really thinking if we've caused this much destruction in our brief span of time. And over 1 million animals are at risk of extinction. Animals that had nothing to do with any of this. Mind you, we're animals too. And on January 1st, 2021, the Basel Convention put in place a treaty that seeks to limit the hazardous waste that's just shipped from nation to nation, and made amendments that tightened control on plastic waste, an outright ban of the materials. And out of the 8 nations that were in attendance, only 1 declined. Do you know what nation that was? I'm not proud to say it. One of the most wasteful nations on the planet. One of the nations that I am a citizen of, and that is the United States. So there's much, much, much that we need to know so that we can act on this. Many people see and saw Glasgow as a failure, and especially a failure in terms of what it promised for the Southern Hemisphere. The main promise that is not in place was to enact measures to keep global temperatures beneath 1.5 degrees Celsius. It was like the main thing that we were supposed to do. And that one thing we couldn't do. What about the promise to deliver 100 billions of solidarity climate finance to these nations. Again, broken promises. This is really terrible. And I want to hear from the other people on our panel, starting with Paul. Paul, what is your thought on the Southern Hemisphere and climate change?
Well, thank you, Regina. So yeah, the Southern Hemisphere is often overlooked or completely ignored in most discussions on climate change. And one of the reasons is that most people, including most climate scientists, live in the Northern Hemisphere. You know, the Northern Hemisphere is where traditionally society has developed, you know, much faster, and there's many large cities, and a huge fraction of the global population lives in the Northern Hemisphere. So we're essentially Northern Hemisphere focused. And, you know, the Earth, of course, is, you know, a system, the climate system, you know, where you can think of the Earth as like a heat engine where heat is transferred from the equator to the poles. And that's both poles, right? It's both the Arctic and the Antarctic. And because the equator is hotter than the poles, the heat moves from the equator to the poles, and it's deflected. The winds are deflected to the right by the rotation of the Earth, you know, forming the jet streams. And I've talked often about the jet stream disruption in the Northern Hemisphere because of the greatly warming Arctic. And that disruption of the jet streams is causing extreme weather events. But these aren't confined to the Northern Hemisphere. When the jet stream gets extremely disrupted because of the greatly warming Arctic in the Northern Hemisphere, we've seen events where it goes right up to the North Pole, it crosses the equator and joins with the jet streams in the Southern Hemisphere. Now, it's almost like the Southern Hemisphere is you know, a different world in a way, because it's really an ocean world, as opposed to, you know, most of the land masses on the planet are obviously in the Northern Hemisphere. But in the Southern Hemisphere, you have vast expanses of ocean, of course. And in fact, you can orient the globe such that you're looking at the globe from one side and all you see is ocean, you know, in the Pacific. I mean, it's just, you know, I mean, Earth should really be called, you know, water world, or, you know, ocean world or something. But as far as the climate system is concerned, the jet streams, the movement of air and heat and so on, you know, in the Northern Hemisphere, like I said, is intricately tied to the same movement of ocean currents and air movement in the Southern Hemisphere. And when you disrupt the pattern, the global circulation patterns, you disrupt both the Northern and Southern Hemisphere. And there's lots of ice melt, you know, that we focus on, and loss of sea ice in the Arctic. Well, Antarctica is shedding ice like crazy, the Antarctic continent. And remember that, you know, if we were to lose Greenland, we're talking about 7 meters of sea level rise, the loss of ice on Greenland. Globally, with no ice, we're talking about 70 meters. So there's about 5 meters, or 5 to 10 meters from the West Antarctic ice sheet, and the rest from a combination, mostly from Antarctica, but also from glaciers on mountains. And we're seeing extreme weather events taking off like crazy in the Southern Hemisphere, but they don't get the press that the ones in the Northern Hemisphere do. But don't let that fool you, because there's a lack of press. You can just go to various YouTube channels or websites and see the South American heat waves, the torrential rains wiping out infrastructure, the Australian heat and wildfires and torrential rains leading to floods. You know, a few years ago, the loss of billions of animals in Australia. The low-level marine clouds over the ocean, which cause cooling, have been decreasing. There's fewer of those in the Southern Hemisphere, and we can measure the overall albedo, or reflectance of the Earth, and we see that those clouds are no longer there in the quantity that they were before. The oceans, of course, absorb over 90% of all the heat excess. on the Earth. And of course, the Southern Hemisphere has the bulk of the oceans, as I've said, and 70% of the planet is covered by oceans. So there's lots of, we cannot ignore the Southern Hemisphere in the climate system. It needs equal prominence to the Northern Hemisphere. And, you know, it does come into the news quite frequently. For example, the latest in Antarctica is the Thwaites Glacier, which is destabilized, and the people studying it say it could actually break apart, you know, in about a 5-year time scale or so. And if it did so, it would cause a very abrupt rise in uptick in ocean sea levels. And of course, you know, when there's huge, there's intricate connections between the two poles. For example, you know, if the melt of Greenland is enormous, that raises global sea levels, and that can raise up the West Antarctic ice sheet off of the bedrock that it's sitting on, and greatly increase the melt rate and the rate of calving on coastlines, et cetera, et cetera. So also, you know, ocean acidification, of course, is becoming a bigger and bigger problem, and you know, it's happening everywhere. So yeah, we can't forget about the Southern Hemisphere.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. And I have to say, I'm obviously in the Northern Hemisphere, but even I know that the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet is it can very easily have strong implications for New York City and the New York Harbor. And also, it just astounds me that this species, Homo sapien, has been able to enact so many changes in our climate and so many different climate systems. And I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this, Peter.
Well, the Southern Hemisphere makes me think immediately of by far the most vulnerable continent countries in the world, which of course we've known for decades is Africa. I agree with the sentiment that global North, people who are well off, they seem to have been saying, oh, it's just Africa again. Of course, now though, in the North, they should be singing a different tune, because of course we are being hit by extreme weather events as well. Africa, as well as being highly vulnerable to the changes of the climate, including drought, heat waves, and severe downpours, storms. Of course, we all know that it's the least able country in the world. It hasn't got the infrastructure and the technologies that the other countries in the North have. So, yet again, today, 45,000 people are trying to struggle to recover from a severe tropical storm. It's hit Congo, Central Sahel, Sudan, Somalia, many countries. The storm trounced Madagascar, and then it came inland and trounced Mozambique and those other countries. Now, it seems only a few years ago that this happened before. The name of this current storm is Ada. I think the other one was Idea or something like that. And it took months and months and months and months and months for those people to recover. And the photographs, of course, from the flooding, massive flooding, again, are horrendous. And the people are again desperate. The IPCC Working Group 1 report, they had some dramatic maps. Africa has been hit in practically all the sub-Saharan countries by extreme heat. Most of Africa has been hit by extreme drought as well. Africa has been hit the worst of any regions by drought. The food security situation in Africa is terrible right now. We have millions of people hungry in Africa, and all this, of course, is being made worse by the increasing extreme weather events. The poor people in Africa are very, very vulnerable to world food prices going up, And in the past 6 months or so, food prices have shot up over 20%. So the Africans, they're completely dependent on supplementing their homegrown food production by buying on the market. But when prices go up like that, the poor people can, many of them will not be able to do that. I recall at the Cancun summit, the United Nations summit, I think it was 2010, that was the summit where the African countries got really diplomatically angry. They were going to walk out of the conference because nobody was listening to their righteous, just demands that instead of 2 degrees C, the world agreed to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees C. Of course, we know now that 1.5 degrees C is globally disastrous. Now, at the time they were doing that, I was reading some reports saying that the treatment of Africa, the negligence of Africa with respect to doing anything about climate change was economic genocide. And I totally agree with that. I was terribly shocked some years ago when an IPCC assessment projected that there would be a huge reduction in food production, in crop yields in sub-Saharan Africa. But they said, well, the Northern Hemisphere, we think is going to grow more, so that's no problem. So the Africans will just have to buy more on the open market. That was absolutely horrible, and confirms in my mind that those people that were saying we're looking at a African climate change genocide are absolutely right. Because the projections, of course, for Africa are absolutely terrible. Most of Africa, and also most of South America, by the way, will have great trouble continuing to grow their crops, because at 1.5 degrees C, they will be way above the intolerant high temperatures of 35 degrees, according to the IPCC Working Group 1. So terrible situation for the Southern Hemisphere, being trashed by climate change because of the negligence of the global North.
Thank you so much for bringing up Africa, Peter. In terms of the Southern Hemisphere, I agree. We speak so little about it, and so little is spoken about the massive continent of Africa. And it's really shocking when you consider that we all come from there. And how is it when we left however long ago it was and just simply turned our backs on the mother continent? It really makes you wonder. And the idea of subsistence farmers having to eke out a meager existence and then try to buy food, well, you know, it's great for the Northern Hemisphere, isn't it? But it's so incredibly unconscionable. And absolutely a humanitarian disaster in the making. Paul, do you have any thoughts about the human effects of this?
Yes, you know, and thank you both for talking about Africa. You can probably recall a few years ago in South Africa, there was this horrible drought, and the major cities like Cape Town were within a week or so of completely running out of drinking water, running out of potable water. And, you know, historically, the global countries in the Northern Hemisphere, you know, large countries, developed countries, have taken raw materials from Africa and exploited Africa, even the people, you know, of Africa going back in history. So, you know, but often, again, we don't think of the climate of Africa. We don't talk about extreme weather events in Africa, you know, that much. And, you know, that data is all available. The part of the IPCC reports recently, they had this climate atlas, and they did a regional analysis. And if you go and look at the, you know, just look at the report and go to the chapters on regional analysis, and you can look at how climate change is affecting, you know, any individual country that you want, essentially. And, you know, it's well worth, you know, having a look at, you know, how terrible things are in various African countries. And of course, they just don't have the money to cushion the shocks of food prices. And, in fact, some large countries are buying up farmland in Africa and basically having dibs on the food that is grown in Africa. So even local African farmers that are working and growing this food don't have rights to the food after it's grown. It's shipped off to places like China to feed growing populations in northern countries. So, like I said, the Southern Hemisphere it's half of the planet. It's vital for the operation and of the Earth system, the climate system. It can't be ignored. I mean, we're in a global system, a climate system. There's, like I said, very hot equator, cold poles, heat traveling from the equator to the poles, sets up the air and wind motions, the jet streams, and also the water motions, the meridional overturning systems. And, it's a vital sink of carbon dioxide in the southern oceans. And as the oceans are greatly warming, that sink is reducing in strength. And there's huge problems without enough vertical circulation of the water. Through the water columns, you have problems with not enough oxygen deep down, and not enough nutrients going up to the surface to stimulate the phytoplankton and get the marine food chain growth happening. So we have huge issues. We need to look at the Earth system as a whole, and never forget to include what's going on in the Southern Hemisphere.
Thank you so much for that. The whole other issue of the warming of the ocean is in itself another topic. And of course, we have had that as a topic, but I know a lot of the countries in the Southern Hemisphere rely on the ocean as another source of food. And with the depletion of that and the increase of oceanic dead zones, that's just yet another way that we are adding insult to injury on the Southern Hemisphere. Peter, your thoughts?
So in the Southern Hemisphere, of course, it's the summer. So the unusually extraordinarily massive wildfires have made headlines in Argentina. But also, of course, the droughts are hitting very hard. I've been watching the drought maps, and Argentina drought has been spreading and intensifying across a huge region now. Chile is in a mega drought, and this year it's worse than ever. It's expanded worse than ever. Then we have Ecuador as well, a great food producing country, and that is also in severe drought. So the projections of extreme weather events increasing, including drought, which was specifically made by IPCC Working Group 1, are already coming to pass. We're already seeing this, and we're only at 1.1 something degrees C. The droughts in Africa, in the Horn of Africa and in Kenya and Somalia and those countries, I've been watching those spread and intensify. Also across the other side into West Africa, spreading, intensifying droughts. And I stress that we are just over 1 degree C and 1.5 degrees C. That number that the Africans years and years and years ago fought for, 1.5 for us to stay alive, okay, that is now unavoidable. James Hansen, thank goodness, has written 2 reports saying that everybody who is apparently totally deluded in the nonsense that 1.5 degrees C is still possible, he's called that BS, and good for him. The science makes it absolutely, completely impossible for us to avoid 1.5 degrees C. And the whole world should be preparing for it. So that this is absolutely ludicrous. In preparing and adapting and resilience, which everybody's talking about, quite rightly. We have to do that on a global basis. There's no other way to do it. That means that all countries have to realize that there's only one race, there's a human race, and we're all in the same boat, which is burning and sinking. In the global north, we're dependent on food exports from Africa, from food exports to South America. So when one country is hit by extreme weather events, it will and is already affecting us all. Our food prices, everybody's noticed, are going up in the Northern Hemisphere. Hugely. They've never gone up as fast. So we have to treat the Africans with total compassion for their plight, because if we don't, we are going to suffer the same fate. Our children are going to suffer the same fate. So it's high time that humanity got together, scrap all their war machines, give up all their warring craziness, and deal with and attack the big, greatest issue ever facing humanity, which of course is global climate change. And that means taking on the fossil fuel industry and telling the fossil fuel industry it's time to quit.
Thank you so much for that impassioned plea, Peter. I always appreciate your hopefulness, your enthusiasm for what can be. You know, they're really popular, these Marvel comic movies. And in these films, there's like this bad evil force. I don't know if it's the Hulk or the Joker or whatever it is destroying the metropolis, and everyone comes together and everyone's on the same team to like, let's overcome this bad influence that's oppressing us. If we could only get people to band together to see that that enemy from without is within, it is what we've caused. It is climate change. And we have to stop the silliness of fighting against each other and thereby causing more climate change, and look at the existential threat which we and all future generations of all species are facing. And that is climate change, global warming. And those of you who are watching, if you have ideas on how we can motivate people to take this seriously, if you have ideas of actions that people can take, please put them in the comments. I'm sure we haven't thought of everything, and we would love to have your thoughts on this. And as always, if you have any ideas on future shows or concepts you'd like us to cover, please put that in the comments as well. And if you haven't, like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe. We want to keep you with us. And thanks again for joining us for yet another Climate Emergency Forum.